all of us. So whether it impacts us directly or whether it impacts us indirectly, it still impacts us. I want us to understand, and this is really important, that I'm going to be spending the next 6 or 7 weeks talking about the institution of the family, and hopefully give all of us a biblical perspective or view of what God's intent of the family is to be. The family. God has designed the family to be the building block of every society. I don't know if you know this or not, but when the communists took over the former Russia, then formerly Soviet Union, they decided in their Marxism that the family unit, the traditional family as you and I understand it, was not necessary. So they got rid of it. And then within a few generations, they discovered that it wreaked so much devastation in their society that they reinstituted the family. And they made getting a divorce in the Soviet Union one of the most difficult things you could do. They placed that much emphasis, that much importance on the family unit within their particular country at the time. So it's not just Christians who think the family is essential. Atheistic countries decided that the family unit was really important as well. I also want to say that if you want to destroy a society from within, then you destroy the family. And I mean, I'm talking about pretty much, the family unit. And I understand that family unit can be comprised in a variety of ways, but that unit is a building block within the world in which we live, the society in which we find ourselves. Now, biblically speaking, again, there are variations to this, and oftentimes those variations are through no fault of people who have a different variation. But the ideal that God intended for us to have was a husband and a wife, which usually meant being a father and a mother, having children, being connected to the grandfather and to the grandmother, and then having extended family like uncles, aunts, cousins, etc. And it went in that kind of a way inwardly and further out from husband and wife to grandparents, to aunts and uncles and cousins and things like that, in terms of fidelity and how you would include them and things like that. The husband and wife are crucial. If the husband and wife are healthy, the family is healthy. There's some exceptions. But by and large, the husband and wife, and let me just say this, you can even have a husband and wife who don't have children. But if that relationship is healthy, it has a way of bearing itself out powerfully in other parts of the family as well. We live in a culture and in a world that does everything that it can to dissolve meaningful relationships between husbands and wives and their children as well. I don't think ever in the history of mankind that the challenges that we are facing in terms of having a family and children have been as significant as they are today. I think when I go back over in history, I don't think I could ever come up with as many forces that are arrayed at dissolving or undermining the family unit and how our children are raised and taught today than what there are now. And so I want to say to you that even in this little church that we are a part of, every inch of soil when it comes to preserving the family unit is important. Every way this church can demonstrate the importance of God's ideal of what a family ought to be is huge. Because what's going on out there is so stark and so contrary that any little thing that we demonstrate here is stark by comparison. Christians are tasked by God to demonstrate to the world, through their devotion to Christ and authentic living, to model God's ideal of family. And when we do that, we are salt and light. We are salt. I can remember growing up in the challenging family that I had. When I would see my friends who came from families that were really healthy, I could see how the parents related to their children. I could see how spouses respected each other and loved each other. And I longed for that in my life. It was just so obvious, so powerful to me. I remember when I started dating Ruth, and I could see her family. Now, her family had its challenges as well, but her family put a tremendous amount of emphasis on family. When I was growing up, I had 5 cousins. They were the sons and daughters of my mother's brother. To this day, I cannot tell you all 5 of their names. I do not know the names of my first cousins. And they live nearby. Ruth's family, on the other hand, I mean, if there was a wedding of the second, fourth, fifth cousin 2 times removed, I mean, they were there. They were at the wedding or whatever. I mean, they were involved. I mean, there were some cousins out in Columbus, Ohio, that were, I can't tell you the connection, but they could. It seemed pretty remote to me, but it didn't matter. They were family. The world needs healthy families as much as we can make them healthy. Some of our hands are tied a bit. I get that. But to whatever degree we can fight to make our families as healthy as we possibly can, it makes a huge difference in the world in which we live. There are 23 million families in our country as of 2021. There are 23 million families, traditional families, that comprise just 17.8% of the households in the United States. So let me just say it again. The 23 million number equals 17.8% of the U.S. households consisting of traditional nuclear family. That's it. Anybody find that a little startling? This is down from 18.6 in 2020 and down even more drastically compared to the previous decades. In 1970, 40% of the USA households consisted of married mother and father with children. In the inner city, as high as, depending on the city, as high as 80% of the families are single-parent families in the inner city. I can tell you as a youth minister for decades that if I had a family where the father was there and they were a church-going family, those kids went to church their entire time they were at home. They went to church. And when they came home from college, they went to church as well. But in the single-parent families, and I want to say this, especially with moms, by the time their kids were 14 or 15 years of age, they normally stopped going to church. And they lost that influence that was a vital part of their life during a very important time in their life. Moms did the best they could, but especially if they had sons who were aggressive, where they did not have a father to control what their sons or daughters were doing, it made it very difficult for the moms. And my heart went out to them, and I would do whatever I could to help. Preserving the nuclear family as close to the biblical ideal that God has given to us is one of the primary ways that we can make a difference in the world in which we live. Now, here's another interesting thing. Up until about 5 to 10 years ago, the most radical changes to families centered predominantly around the rate of divorce, blended families, and the redefining of family to include married, gay, and or lesbian couples. So up until about 5 or 10 years ago, that's what happened. So you had the traditional family, and then people decided that, married and gay couples could adopt children, so they would be called families as well, and so that's what we did culturally. Today, the most dramatic changes related to families have to do with children, questions related to do they belong to their parents or to the state, or what or how will they be educated, particularly when it comes to transgender and LGBTQ++ issues. If you aren't seeing that in the culture today, I don't know how you can't see that. There are about, I believe, 8 or 9 states in the United States right now that if a child says that they want to get some kind of permanent change to their body, whether it's chemical or surgical, so that they can transition from male to female or female to male, there are about 7 or 8 states today that will take your child from you so that your child can receive gender-affirming care. There are children in numerous states now that are being educated in schools that they don't have to decide what their gender is, and they can be in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, that the question is open and is actively taught that they may or may not be a male or a female, and that it's okay to teach them that, and they teach that despite what parents want them to teach. So if you don't have a healthy family and you aren't countering that as a parent, if you are not involved with your children in that kind of a way, then you can see what can happen to our children and what can happen to our families. And this is on the spectrum of any LGBTQ thing. There are many, many states and many thousands of school districts that have books in their libraries that are assigned to your students, to your children, that you would never read, that you would consider to be blatant pornography. In fact, when parents question the school boards about that, and they will be at a school board and they will read portions of that book, and the school board will stop them and say, why you are not allowed to read profane things here during a school board meeting, and they will say, why then is this in the library? Why are you assigning this to my child to read? Our families are precious. Our children are precious. And if we do not guard and guide our children appropriately, there's very little that we can do, in many respects, what the world is doing in that way. But there's a lot that we can do as parents and as grandparents about how we guide and lead our children through that kind of thing. Now, obviously, when we talk about family, mothers are enormously important. And so the institution of motherhood, I think, needs to be rescued, preserved, and promoted. In other words, if you're a mother or a grandmother, you are increasingly occupying a special status in our culture because the role of mother has changed so much. And I know most of you, and I know most of you who are mothers and grandmothers and aunts, and I know how devoted you are. I know that you desperately love your sons and your daughters, your grandsons, your granddaughters, your nieces, and your nephews. And I'm saying to you, as a woman who values the institution of motherhood, that you continue to have a primary role to play in the lives of those children. I see Debbie back there. She does our preschool. She loves those children like they were her own. Let me just say this. Every year, we have some parents, some moms, who drop off their children, and you would think they are world's best mom. The way they talk, the instructions they give. But just give it a couple of weeks. Isn't that right, Debbie? And you get a different picture. And you know who helps to fill that gap? People like Debbie. We had some volunteers like Beth and Bonnie. Is there anyone else here that helped volunteer with it that's here? You see it. And you see some of those kids are so hungry emotionally. They want to be mommed so badly. Because what's going on at home just isn't what they need. So the biblical understanding of motherhood is that, and so I'm going back to the biblical understanding, particularly in the Old Testament and in the New Testament time periods. The woman's primary role was to be a mother. There was no higher honor than to bear a child. The Old Testament had high regard for faithful motherhood, associated as symbols for the deepest loving attachment and profound sorrow when bereaved. I don't know, I just saw this about a year or so ago, but they were doing some research, and they discovered that when a woman is pregnant, that somehow some of the cells in the amniotic fluid that's associated with their baby make their way to the mother's brain. And they think that deep attachment that a mother has, that we men don't always understand, that deep attachment associated with their children is related to that. It's pretty powerful, isn't it? If that's true. How amazing that would be. So the mother's role is crucial, not only because they have children, but in most cases, they are hardwired to provide what is essential to children emotionally and physically when they are young. Until recently, and I'm saying this a little tongue-in-cheek, mothers were the only ones that could breastfeed their children. You know, don't you, that they're giving men hormone shots so that they can breastfeed their children. Now, there's no research that says this is a good thing. They just decided they're going to try it. They have no idea of the impact this will have on children and their health. Doesn't matter. But in any case, it's been my experience that in my relationship with Ruth, she just took to our smaller children. You know, I mean, when you're two, you can't catch a football very well, no matter how hard you try. Kind of bounces off their head, they cry, you know, all that kind of stuff. But from the first time that either of our children were born and were placed in her arms, she was immediately in love with them. I thought about, well, okay, sleepless nights, more money I got to provide. I mean, you know, you just think about that kind of stuff some as a man. I mean, you love them, but you just think about that kind of stuff as a man. So for the most part, and there are always exceptions to this, God has hardwired women to be especially accessible to children when they are young. Now, there is this text, Proverbs 31, that we oftentimes read during Mother's Day, and sometimes women hate that one because they hate it to be compared to that particular kind of proverb. But it's important to remember that this was the idealized version of what a woman was. In other words, somebody like Solomon got together and said, hey, what are all of the virtues that we appreciate in women Probably no one woman has all of them, but if we were to take all of the virtues and put them together in one particular person, what would that person look like? And so that's what Solomon did when he composed Proverbs 31. So I just want to read it to you, and I'm going to read through it, and then I have some other things I want to talk about in relationship to this. Now, like in creedal-like fashion, Proverbs 31 was read by the father to his children every Sabbath evening to seek a woman of virtue as a wife and mother. So he would read it, and he would be, in essence, saying to his daughter, these ideals are very important for you to emulate in your life. And they would be saying to the son, these ideals in a woman are important for you to pursue in a woman. And you need to be the kind of husband that is worthy enough to have a woman who is this worthy in your life. That's what you need. So Solomon writes, a wife of noble character who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of his life. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. This was a huge thing in that time. That's where you did business. That's where that's where you had the social credit to do so much within the community. If your wife embarrassed you or dishonored you, you would lose the ability to leverage things for yourself, for your family, for your children in that way. It was huge. She selects wool and flax and works with her eager hands. She is like the merchant ships bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it is still dark. She provides food for her family and portions for her servant girls. So remember that, ladies. Provide portions for your servant girls that you have living in your home, okay? She makes coverings for her bed. She is clothed in fine linen and purple. She makes linen garments and sells them and supplies the merchants with sales. She considers a field and buys it out of her earnings. She has planted a vineyard. When it snows, she has no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. I received faithful instruction from my mother at a very early age. And I'm going to say more about that in a few minutes. Her children arise and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the reward she has earned, and let her works bring her praise at the city gate. And so I will say to men, we have a responsibility to praise our wives when they do well, as they do well. Not when, I think most of us all do fairly well, but as they do well. To honor our wives, especially as the kind of sacrifice that they give and have given when it comes to the children that were born to her and to you. We have a responsibility as men to communicate that about our wives. So here are the general virtues. She brings value and honor to family. She does not dishonor her husband. There is a great work ethic and resourcefulness. She is thoughtful of the socially marginalized. She organizes her household well. She cares for her children and their needs. She manages money and resources well. So those were what was included pretty much in Proverbs 31. And so I would say, in our current context, and this would be for both spouses, that in whatever way we do things well, we should encourage, we should support, we should praise, we should honor. How refreshing it is for a husband to say something really positive about his wife in front of other people, or for a wife to say something really positive about her husband. Really, when you think about it, how often does that happen? And it will happen when we are men and women of virtue in that way. This led me to Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment, with a promise. It's the only commandment of the 10 commandments that has a promise. That it may go well with you, and that you may enjoy a long life on the earth. There's a blessing that comes with honoring our parents. So here are some foundational questions I want to ask us all. What does it mean to honor one's mother and father? What does it mean for you to honor your mother and father? Again, I don't mean to keep bringing this up, but for all the difficulty that I had with my father, at the end of his life, I was determined that I would honor him. That as much as I could, that in whatever way that was appropriate. I kid you not. When we were doing his funeral arrangements, there was one family member who thought that we should buy a used urn to bury him in. And I said, no, that's not going to happen. It's ridiculous that you would suggest that. There's the institution of fatherhood that has to be respected and honored as well. And there are a lot of fathers out there that were not everything they should have been or could have been. But that doesn't mean that we disrespect the office of fatherhood or the office of motherhood. There's a difference between the person and the institution. You know what an institution is? An institution is something that has been established around which you organize society. So like work is an institution. We organize so much of our culture and society around the whole idea of work. Art is an institution because art communicates so many different kinds of things that are important for us to understand. Education is an institution. Parents are an institution. Family is an institution because of how all of life is organized around it. It's essential. Fathers are essential. Mothers are essential. So in what way have we honored our parents? Do we love them? One of the most challenging things for me when my mother had small cell lung cancer was to do what was best for her on one hand without her dignity being robbed on the other. If any of you have been through that, you know what I'm talking about. Because she still wanted to prove to me that she was going to be okay or that she could do these things. And I knew that she couldn't do some of those things. So I had to find a way to let her try as much as possible for her to do what she wanted to do so that she could be content, so that she knew that she still had some sense of health, some value in some way on one hand, without her hurting herself or others in another way. And then her feeling demeaned. How do we honor our parents in whatever way we find them, or whatever place we find them in life? Let me ask you this question. What virtue about your mother did you prize the most? Like your life is the way it is in a very good way because of that virtue or those virtues that she gave to you, that she passed on to you. And have you ever said thank you for that? That your life would be different if your mother had not passed on those things to you in that way. Now, some moms pass on more than others. All moms pass on something that's worth something, that's valuable, that's good. So let me just say this, like Proverbs 31, if you were to write a compendium of the virtues regarding your mom, what would they be? If you were to write a compendium, in other words, Solomon went out and he grabbed a whole bunch of a compendium of all different kinds of things that made up that he saw as virtuous in various women's lives, and he made a list, and then he wrote it up into Proverbs 31. But if we were to sit down and say, what would be the list of things that my mother gave to me, modeled for me, passed on to me, that made my life qualitatively better? What would those things be? Now, when my mother passed away in 2007, I had a blog that I kept up with a good bit then, and I wrote in that blog my thoughts about her passing. And I don't have time to read all of it here. Years ago, I read it, I think, once before. But I do want to say this, because I included this as part of it, and then I want to mention a couple of things related to it. But I'll just say this. It's odd how our roles become reversed. When I was an infant and then a child, my mother was stronger and I was the weaker. Then I became a man and she became elderly and sick. Then I was the stronger and she was the weaker. But now there in heaven, she is the stronger and I am the weaker. What a great and amazing thought. To a fault, she never stopped being a mother. She utterly exhausted herself, her resources, and everything she had to make sure that we would somehow have a better life. Anything that I might know about love, grace, kindness, sacrifice, and service, or anything else virtuous, I observed and learned it from her first. I look eagerly forward to our eventual reunion in the next life. Only there, she will still be the stronger and I will be the weaker. Because in her quiet legacy, she will have done more with her life than I did with mine. She had a lot less to work with. A lot less to work with than what I had. But she somehow managed to do some amazing things despite the enormous deficits that were handed to her. And she did more with her life qualitatively than I think I did with mine. I have a wonderful family. I am the only one on either side of the family for generations to have ever gone to college just to get their college degree, let alone their master's or doctorate degree. But I've spoken all over the country at the highest levels of my profession when I was teaching at Geneva College. But for all of those accomplishments, I still have not achieved what she did. So this is kind of a way for me to honor my mom. And I've shared these kinds of things with people before in the past. But I do want to share with you for a few more minutes some of the virtues, the compendium of virtues that I saw in my mom. Oftentimes during Mother's Day, I have people come up and share about their experience with their mom and how their mom made an impact on their life and the virtues that they had. So I guess this is my turn, and I'm going to share some of them with you. The first thing I want to say is that my mother survived a husband and 4 boys. And it was not without its challenges. All kinds of challenges. Just craziness that boys do, the trouble that they get into. My mother still loved them, us. Just the everyday things of trying to feed us, if you can imagine, 4 boys. My oldest brother, Bill, whom many of you have met, when he was in his 20s and 30s, he was pretty strong. And a lot of times when he would come over, he would pick my mother up like this, and he would throw her up in the air. And she would scream. One time he threw her so high, she hit the ceiling, bounced back down. He caught her, which was good. We'd hold her down and give her kisses and all that kind of stuff, and she'd scream. One time, we had a big spaghetti dinner, and we went out front right afterwards, and in a spontaneous moment, I picked her up. I was on the ground. She was on this porch-like stoop, which was about a foot higher. And as I picked her up, it was either the spaghetti dinner or it was her. Because if it was the spaghetti dinner, it would still be her, if you know what I'm saying. So I had to drop her on the stoop. And my father, who was sitting next to that, just looked over and said, "Don't drop your mother like that. You might hurt her, you know." She said, "He have killed me," and that's all you can say. But she survived us in that way. And that was no small task. In terms of hospitality, if somebody stopped by, it was never a problem for her to throw another burger in the skillet or whatever. And you would never think that you were putting her out in any sort of way. She was that kind of a person. She was very, 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 very good at that kind of a thing. If somebody had a funeral or if there was a wedding, she was the first to offer cakes or casseroles. That's what she did. And she was glad to do it. Ruth's mother was that way too. I don't think, Ruth's mother, if all the casserole dishes were ever returned to her that she gave away to people, I can't begin to tell you, I don't know where you'd store them. Her mother was the same kind of person. My mother was humble. A lot of humility. She never put on any airs. Do you ever see some women who, my wife sometimes uses the phrase, mutton dressed as lamb? Women who try to dress like 30 years younger than what they really are. Mutton dressed as lamb. An old sheep dressed like a lamb. And you think, like, why are you doing that? You're perfectly attractive the way that you are. You don't have to be something that you aren't. But my mother was very humble in that way. I mean, humble in her ability, humble in terms of how she handled herself, just didn't presume anything in a very good way. My mother was always connected to her boys. When my oldest brother came home from Vietnam, he was in Kansas City. He went through a severe bout of PTSD, which resulted in a pretty violent interaction in the officers' mess. The MPs came in and they messed him up. He probably got more messed up there than he did when he served 2 tours in Vietnam. We hadn't heard from him for a while. The phone rang one evening, and this is no lie. My mother jumped up from the chair. She picked up the phone. You know, they hung on the wall back then. She picked up the phone and she said, "Bill, what's wrong?" True story. She just knew intuitively that was him, and she knew something was wrong. There was another time involving my brother where, as a constable, he had to shoot a man who was robbing a store that he was working at. And those men, so one of them got away, 2 of them got away, and the one they don't know where he is. But those men decided they would try to seek revenge on my brother for doing that. And so he called us. We lived out in the country. We lived in a ranch home about 6 miles out of town, and so he called us and said that he was in this efficiency apartment across from where he worked. It was a total tactical nightmare. There was no way he could get out by himself, and so he called us for help. And so my father called me in from outside and said, they called me Rick. He said, "Rick, can you come in here?" So I said yes, and so I went in and he said, your brother's in trouble in town, go get your shotgun. And I went to my room and I walked past the room where my 15-year-old brother was in. I was 16, and he was loading his shotgun. And I went in to get mine, and I was a Christian at the time. And I walked out in the hallway, and there's my mom walking up and down the hallway, praying, not sure what's going to happen. We did horrible things to her, didn't we? In some ways, huh? My mother was always present at the grade school productions, those horrible music festival things that you do that nobody really appreciates, but you go anyway. She was always there. I would always be there looking for her, and there she'd be. Always there to support us in that way. I remember one time we were walking home from school, and this is literally one of those things where you walk uphill both ways. You encounter a grizzly bear and you fight it off with your loose leaf notebook. It was almost one of those kinds of things, right? And so, but it was a storm of storms like we've had. And I walked a mile to school when I was about 7 or 8 years of age. And so we're walking home and this deluge hit. We can't see. We don't, and my youngest brother got scared and hid under some hedges, and I started trying to get home, and I ran right into the legs of my mom with an umbrella. My mom was really capable of some funny things too. So when I was a freshman in college, and I guess I'll have to conclude with this one, I can't get to them all, but she was fun. She was curious. And so one day I was hunting in this field across from our house. So our house was on this hill. I was hunting on this hill, back up in these woods. And I got a nice 7-point. My younger brother was with me. We field dressed the deer. We dragged it down to the hillside. And we didn't want to drag it across the highway, across the creek, up to our house. And so my brother shot his gun, and my parents came to the window. They looked out the window. They saw us on the other side of the hill. So my mother, who was very modest, ran out on the deck in her pink, fuzzy housecoat with her pink, fuzzy slippers. And she just said, "Is that you?" And I said, "Yeah, that's us. We got a deer, bring the car." She ran into the house. She got her purse. And in her pink, fuzzy nightgown or housecoat and pink, fuzzy slippers, she got into this big Ford LTD station wagon, the kind with the fake wood along the side. And she peeled out and went down the road and went around and came up here, and she pulled into this pull-off spot where I could drag the deer down. And we did. So my brother and I have the front end of the deer, and if you've ever done deer, their head hangs down like this, and so you got to pick the head up and the legs, and you got to try and put them in the car, Well, my mother thought she would try to help. So for whatever reason, she thought it was important to get out of the car with her purse on her shoulder and her pink fuzzy housecoat with her pink fuzzy slippers, and she went around the back, and she reached down to pick up the back of the deer's legs, and her purse went down her arm, down the leg of the deer, and almost into the cavity of the deer. Just sort of hanging off the leg like this, And then she just threw her head back, and she started laughing. She thought it was the funniest thing that her purse was hanging off the leg of this deer, almost in the cavity, the bloody cavity of the deer itself. How refreshing that is, that she could just in that moment enjoy that. When we got home with the deer, my dad came out and said, in 30-some years of marriage, I have never known your mother to ever go out of the house without her makeup and her hair done and her clothes on. That is the first. When it comes to you kids, she will do anything. And that is true. There's more that I could say. It's sort of up there. Yeah, well, it's, that's what we had back then, so you just got to toss it in there and clean it out later, I guess. But that's why I get a truck, because, I have to have some place to throw something dead, when I go hunting. So anyway, I will always remember the contribution that my mother made to my life. There was a lot of things about me that I am like my father. But in my core, in my character, if you see anything in terms of character in me, you see my mother. As Christ has redeemed that in me, you see my mother. And so I would encourage you all that when you have the opportunity to, in a very specific and loving way, either write or speak personally to your mom and say, thank you for giving me these things, for doing these things in my life. Because in whatever way that's good in me, you gave it to me. And thank you for doing that. And by extension, I want to say to you that when we do those things, we send to a powerful message to people out there who are motherless, who don't have very good mothers, who don't come from very good families. We make them hunger to have what we have. And we make the gospel all that more appealing because of that. Will you pray with me? Lord, thank you so much for this morning, and thank you for the wonderful institution of motherhood, of womanhood. Thank you for the many, many tremendous contributions that they've made to our lives. Bless them. Empower them. Encourage them. Give them peace. So many mothers I know have elements of where they're just paralyzed by guilt when they shouldn't be about certain things. Release them from that. And help them to see themselves through the eyes of Christ. And help us to help them see themselves through the eyes of Christ by honoring them in whatever way that we can. In your name we pray these things. Amen. This time, I'd like the elders to come forward. We can celebrate the Lord's Supper this morning. If you know and love Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you are welcome to partake of the Lord's Supper here this morning. Let me just say now the words of the institution, that on the night in which he was betrayed, Jesus took the bread and he broke it and said, "This is my body which is broken for you. Eat this in remembrance of me." In the same way, he took the cup saying, "This cup is my blood shed for you. Drink this in remembrance of me." And as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again.